Yeah guys, Wallop Viper here, and we've been talking very thoroughly about Illuvium Overworld, which I think is the most polished out of all the Illuvium games at the moment. Today I want to talk a little bit more about the PvP games, especially the Ascendant Arena. Gauntlet is going to follow in a separate video. So I'll give some thoughts, some feedback, and some fundamental changes that I think have to happen to Ascendant Arena, because the game mode is this mix of 1v1 card game and Battle Royale, auto battler kind of thing. And I think this first iteration isn't working. So why do I think that this first iteration just fundamentally has some flaws that really need to be addressed? Because TLDR, I think it is leaning a lot harder towards the auto battler side. That only works because some of the things are just Battle Royale setting. And there's a lot of other aspects to it. I'll explain a little bit about, TFT is pretty much the monopoly auto battler game at the moment. I'll explain a little bit about that and why that game is so good and why that game is catching the masses essentially. And I think you cannot replicate all of the things that catch the masses in the setup that TFT is having in a 1v1 game. So let's just quickly go back on what is a 1v1 card game, how does it work? I don't know how gaming savvy everybody who's watching is, right? So 1v1 card game, a trading card game, usually both players build a deck of cards and then they go into a game. You toss a coin or something, decide who starts the game, and then like a mana-based card game is the most simple one, which means you get like 1 energy per turn, and the cards cost energy. And then, I don't know, turn 1 you can play a 1 cost card, turn 2 a 2 cost card, like very simplified. So you have the elements of the randomness from drawing cards, right? And those kind of change the game, and you obviously usually have some kind of restrictions on who can play what cards, and then there's a lot of different decks in the game, and that gives you replayability because you don't draw the same cards every game, your opponent doesn't draw the same cards every game, and you don't play the same deck every game, your opponent doesn't play the same deck every game. Now, the auto battler genre uses a really big shared deck of cards that everybody essentially draws from, that is, so to say, in the middle of the table. And the standard auto battler setup is something like you see 5 cards and you have an amount of currency and you can buy cards and you can then play them as creatures. They get summoned, and then once a round starts, it's not like in the card game where you can pick, okay, this attacks here, this attacks here. No, they just go and fight like autonomously, right? That's why it says auto battler. Now, how's their replayability? Well, because again, you essentially have this card draw RNG, you don't see the same things every single game. But the big difference is you don't go into the game with like, okay, this is my deck, this is my strategy. No, you have to adapt a lot more to the circumstances and to what is happening in the game. And outside of drawing cards in the game, there's a tremendous extra amount of things that happen that impact your decisions in the game. That's why I think that TFT has been developing that really well over the last 5 years, is probably the best strategy game in the world at this point. Let's quickly go over because card games, like everybody kind of knows card games, right? But not everybody knows TFT, so let's quickly go over the just like interesting elements of that game. Basically, you have units, right? And similar how you know in Illuvium, the units, they have abilities and they have traits. The traits are a bit more simple than in Illuvium, but it's very similar. The abilities are also a lot more simple than in Illuvium, to be honest, and there's no rogue class. They used to have that, but they have removed that because it was just really unhealthy for the game, so to say. I also think that rogues are really unhealthy for Illuvium as a whole. They are super unhealthy for the game because rogues essentially diminish the agency that players have in the game, because it makes it very coin flippy. It's very much, are you on the right side? Are you on the right positioning? Yes or no? And there's no in between. There's no like nuances or skill or anything. It's usually just very polarizing, and it's really hard to like manage the game, and that's why TFT most likely removed them, and TFT moved on this auto battler combat side to something that is very like front to back, how you would know from like playing a MOBA game or something like that, where you have the tanks in the front line, and then you have like some melee damage dealers or semi-low range damage dealers behind that usually have like some sort of like healing or defensive mechanisms as well, like not really glass cannon. And then in the backline you have like the standard like range damage dealers or utility characters, which is a big difference to Illuvium and Illuvium's fundamental setup, because Illuvium is a lot more like glass cannon melee damage dealers, or rogues and a lot of like backline access, and there's no safe positioning in Illuvium or anything like that. It's very rarely a front to back fight. So that makes a lot of things in Illuvium, just the way that the units and the fights and the traits are set up, a lot more polarizing compared to in TFT, which in TFT makes a lot of these small nuance things, just doing the fundamentals of the game right, a lot more impactful than these hyper polarizing, easy to see things. Like, it's very easy to see, do I play left or right or middle? Do I put this in the front, in the middle, or in the back? Every silver elo player can see that. It's a lot harder to see, okay, I have these 100 other things that I have to keep in mind and pay attention to and make decisions throughout the game. I have to make all of them correct. And that is the crazy part about TFT, where you have these hundreds of decisions throughout the game and they all impact what you do. And there's no crazy polarizing thing like in the Illuvium, especially 1v1, that just outdoes all of those. Like in the Illuvium-Arena, that's the fundamental flaw that I want to get at. Just choosing the right side, or because of hyper, choosing just the right element of units will outperform all the other small decisions made. It is just super, super polarizing on that end. Part of it is just rogues existing. Part of it is obviously the abilities being a lot more like crazy in terms of what they do. A lot of backline access, a lot of sniping units and such doesn't really exist in TFT. I don't necessarily think that that is a bad thing. I think rogues are a bad thing. They shouldn't exist. They are super polarizing, and you should kind of try to fix this left or right hyper polarizing thing in the Ascendant Arena as well. Part of that is the setup where you both play your turn at the same time, and you have these like a lot of mastery points per turn. Like, the other parts of TFT probably make it more into a gauntlet focused video, but I want to quickly go over that just so you guys have more of an idea why this is like so different and why the Battle Royale setting is a lot different to the 1v1 setting. I've pretty much alluded to the main criticism or that I have for Ascendant Arena. We'll go over some more of the just information here, and then I'll give some ideas on how I think you can fix that. So right, like there's the units. The units have very similar setup like in Illuvium. Then you have traits, very, very similar, basic kind of things, right? The composites in Illuvium, probably a bit more powerful, I would say, or a bit more interesting, a bit more different than like the standard traits here, because standard traits here are something like dragon attacks and abilities, they burn and wound enemies. Gives you health and gives you an item that gives damage amp, right? What is this? You gain like a NPC unit that helps you fight. You gain some ability power and so on and so on. It's like very simplistic traits, very simplistic unit setup. TFT puts a lot more emphasis on all the following things. While Illuvium puts a lot more emphasis on having those things be unique and interesting and impactful, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think that's a really, really good thing. But you cannot copy like the TFT fundamentals if you also have these more different unique abilities, because then you want to put emphasis on just different parts of the game, right? Big difference in TFT compared to Illuvium. This is more on the Gauntlet side of things, right? One of the main things I want to see changed in Gauntlet. I don't think this applies a whole lot to Ascendant Arena, but in TFT you essentially have small item components that give like small stat bonuses, and if you put two of them together, you get a really, really powerful item. Maybe even Ascendant Arena, because we see these armor, I call them armories because that's what you use in TFT, but when you have these choices of 3 augments appear and you can pick one, and then you can give that to an Illuvial as an item, right? Maybe you should be getting these component-like things as well, and then you have the option of making the more powerful ones. So you have a bit more agency on what to do, because right now, essentially, or any kind of case in the future, you can probably just see the completed augment in Illuvium, right? And if the thing gives it to you and all your choices are bad, that's really bad. But if it gives you these small ones, then you have more decision making in the game, because then you have a couple, like you have 4 of these items, right? There's a bunch of combinations that you can go for. You just get 2 completed items. Well, you got 2 completed items, that's it, right? And those small things, they really matter, where you want to give the players more input, more chances to make the right, more chances to make the wrong decision. That's the second super big criticism that I have on Ascendant Arena, that players don't have enough room to make mistakes. It is very, very straightforward in the sense of you tell somebody, okay, you play these units every turn, and you wanna maybe side swap with this. Or if your opponent plays water, then you swap this out for air or something like that. Very, very simplistic, very little room for mistakes, and very polarizing decision making. If you give people these item components, for example, instead of the completed items, then, well, now somebody has to on the spot think, okay, do I make item A, B, or C? And they can make a mistake there, right? That is what essentially separates the top players from the non-top players. Then the augments in TFT are essentially comparable to like the legendary augment selection in Illuvium, basically, but there's no betting versus each other because it's 8 players. You just get something that you can select from and you pick, and that's cool. Legendary augment betting is another thing that has to go. It's a horrendously bad mechanic because it is always polarizing. It is always just favoring one player, and it is really unfun, I think. Like so many games, you just win or lose because your opponent gets favored from legendary augment bets, and the best thing that you can hope for is if you bet the same as your opponent and nothing happens, and anything else is bad for you because your opponent just has more good options than you have, or you have a bunch of useless options and you still have to bet on them so your opponent doesn't get them, and so on and so on. Legendary augment betting, I mean, an interesting idea. I don't think there's a version of it that works out on a high level of the game, essentially. Just let both players choose something really strong, like whatever. And then the portals thing, that is in TFT. Essentially, at the beginning of the game, one of these effects happens and it impacts every single player, right? Like every single player here starts with a random with 3 random 1-cost champions. Or you start with 1 random 3-cost, or you get more items, or like this costs 50% less if you want to buy it in the game, like throughout the entire game and so on. Those give a lot more replayability to the game because the same as the augments, it's not the same every game. You're not going for the same thing every game, and it makes different play styles, different teams to play stronger or weaker. So it gives a lot of replayability to the game. Then this thing here is called charms. On TFT, they usually go by like a 3-month set, so they say, and then there's like one mechanic that just exists in that set. Like just another something that changes the game for like 3 months, and if it's a really, really good thing, like augments and portals have started like that, they just keep it. And if it's maybe not so great, or people didn't like it that much, or it's not compatible with the next thing, then it just goes away, right? Like an Illuvium comparison would be if, for example, this game you have more or less Ascension tokens. This game you have more or less mastery points to play with. Very, very bad thing in a 1v1 game again, because in the 1v1 game, where you go into with a built deck already, it's just gonna hardcore favor one player, and it sucks. Like you just load into the game and you know you're unfavored because of the random effect happening in the game. That's pretty shit. This is one of the things that I've heard people say and suggest a lot, and especially in the earlier days of Arena, just like make something like this, where like some random effect, you cannot do that in 1v1. Like it is so horrendously bad because it's just gonna favor one player over the other for no reason, and the player has no input in it. It's the same exact criticism of legendary augments. A comparison on something that would work in a 1v1 thing though, like these charms are essentially buffs or things that happen that you can buy for currency that just appear in your shops throughout the game, right? You could have this appear. You could have, for example, instead of only getting the augments via maybe components, right? Components to make augments, I think that would be a first great change. Then a second cool change would be maybe you can spend mastery points on buying more components. Spend mastery points on buying some effects. Maybe for 1 turn a combat buff, maybe another component, maybe an extra unit, maybe an extra ascension token, maybe. I think those would be cool things, because that's another thing where then a player has to decide, do I spend mastery points on this or do I not? And it just, you need a lot of these. Like I used to refer to that as a noob trap, so to say, where like sure, if everybody plays perfect and makes perfect decisions all the time, you coin flip every single game in existence. Because if both players play perfect, how else would it be? But you need more of these small things where people have to make a decision, and if they have to make a decision, they can make the wrong one. And that is what separates really good from bad players, essentially. And currently, Ascendant Arena has very few of those decisions, and most of the decisions that exist, they get again outdone by the whole left side, right side positioning. Do I swap this unit out, or do I swap that unit out, and maybe hyper? That's the main takeaway for me. You have to implement more of these small things, small decisions in the game. Making the augments not full augments that you give players, so the items in Illuvium, right? That is one thing. Essentially, then players can decide, do I wait for another component and make this better augment that I want, or do I just make this augment now? I'm stronger on this turn. Very impactful decisions, very interesting decisions to make as well. I think this charms mechanic this TFT has in the latest set, in the current one even, also very interesting when you probably, do I spend mastery points on playing this unit right now, or do I buy this buff? Because oftentimes, at some point, mastery points are relatively abundant anyways, right? Like, what are you even going to spend them on? So if you spend the mastery points early on for this combat strength buff, maybe, that is probably weaker on that turn, but then it's stronger later on. Can you get to later on? Is it worth it? Is it in the current setting, how the current turns played out, how the item components that people gotten played out, and so on? Those are really interesting decisions, and those are things that should be added. Okay, but the super fundamental change that I think has to happen, like the current setup where you both play these really big turns blindly versus each other, it does not work in the game the way it currently is. If the game would be this front to back fighting, like in Teamfight Tactics, for example, where you have tanks, you have like melee damage dealers that are like drain tanks most of the time, so they can take some damage and they don't get instantly killed and whatnot, and then you have like the ranged carries behind, it would probably be okay and it would probably work because then the left or right side positioning wouldn't be as polarizing. But the way it currently is in Illuvium, in the Ascendant Arena, positioning is insanely polarizing, and that will never change as long as we both play these super blind turns versus each other. Because I can swap my team's positioning blindly, I can play new units blindly, I can swap out units blindly. And that's it. I think that's really bad. So my take on that, you want to split these long blind turns into smaller turns. It's essentially, okay, maybe you both have 100 mastery points to play your turns. One guy goes first and he puts an Illuvia on the board. Then the other guy has turn, puts an Illuvia on the board. Then your turn, you now know, okay, my guy is here, the other guy played a guy there, I put this guy here. Or I just move my guy here and so on, right? You just split these entire blind turn up into smaller movements. Maybe have people play 2 units or 2 moves at the same time, right? This is all stuff that comes down to the turn timer. You don't want turn timers to go too long, right? So if both players make like 10 actions in a turn, maybe the turns are too long, right? So maybe make 2 actions at the same time, or later on in the game you have to make 3 actions at the same time. Something like that, right? You can scale that. Early game, I mean, I don't know, 1 action, I play a unit, the other guy plays a unit, it's not going to take a lot of time. Mid-game, maybe 2, then maybe 3 actions at the same time. Maybe make it you can only move a unit once per turn or only 2 times per turn, and so on, right? You can just put in a bunch of restrictions and rules around this, but fundamentally have it that players have a move, and then the other guy has a move, and it's not just blind and bam, combat. So that's the main takeaway that I have on how to fix most of the hyper-polarizing things. Where it's like one guy just full swaps the team to water, and the other guy just stayed on Earth. Or the other guy thinks, haha, maybe he's gonna swap to water, I'm gonna swap to air before, and then the guy was just staying on fire and is now beating you. It's like really, really coin flippy at the higher levels of play, which makes it very unenjoyable to play at the higher levels from like my competitive player POV on those things, or also from a, like if somebody is just playing the game a lot, right, they will just run into these things and you'll lose or win games just based on stuff that's essentially coin flip. And once you're good enough at the game to understand that those are coin flips, it's going to feel really bad. And I have one more idea that I think could be really, really good when it comes to how do you implement more of these small decisions into the game. I think, for example, to get something like Ascendant tokens, maybe every turn you should have to like burn a card from your deck, and that card is not usable in this game anymore, right? And obviously, I also think it should be reverted that you don't see each other's decks. I think that's pretty fucking horrible. You should be seeing each other's decks, and you should be maybe having to burn a card from your deck to gain an like Ascension token. Therefore, throughout the game, your opponent and you have to make small decisions every turn on which unit to not have access to anymore at some later stage in the game. And then you have to probably think, okay, my opponent has these options left. Now they only have these options left. I had these options to begin with. Now I only have this left, and so on and so on. So it just implements more small decisions to make and more possibilities for people to make mistakes, which I think is the main thing needed in the game outside of like the fundamental rework of the turn structure. So to recap this, right, essentially, instead of giving people full augments, you should give them components, and 2 components make 1 augment, so players can decide which like full thing to make and when to make it as well. And then I think you should implement maybe these things where you have another thing that's offered to you and you can decide, okay, do I buy this, or this, or do I pass? Right? Do I buy this buff? Do I buy this component? Do I save my points? Do I buy this ascension token? Or again, just another thing that can be implemented in the game where people have to make a decision, and that decision, well, can be a wrong one that then impacts the game. And now, for all of those small things to matter, to have relevant impact, you have to reduce this super polarizing thing of one player just being like, okay, this turn I'm gonna swap my entire team to the left side, and this turn entire team to the right side. And I think you do that by simply just splitting the turn into these smaller turns where people can make like 1, 2, 3 moves, and then it's the next person makes like 1, 2, 3 moves. And at that point, you cannot just do the whole team on this side or the whole team on the other side and so on anymore. And there's a lot more counterplay and a lot more to think about and to do in the game. So yeah, I never really know how detailed or how explanatory I have to be to not be like boring and explain people stuff that they already know, or that I actually help people that are maybe not as gaming savvy, don't know these games or genres a whole lot, maybe more on the investor side of things, which is pretty much a big thing in Illuvium, right? Hope the video helped you. Hope the video gave some insights and cool ideas. If you guys enjoy the content, I would appreciate if you go to your profile, right, and you add the referral Viper in here. And yeah, this is definitely what helps me justify spending a lot of time on making these videos and such. So appreciate all of you guys watching the video, hanging out, and especially the ones who use my referral code. See you in the next one.